A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So 1000 Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer, Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been generously sponsored by an anonymous listener as a schus for all those in Klal Yisrael who need a Yeshua. So, before we get to today's episode, I just wanted to remind the listeners that I'm coming for a trip to the United States, the New York area, the last week of July, probably about July 26th to August through August 1st. Lecture slots are filling up quickly, and I still have a couple of openings left. So be in touch with me about that if your community or shul or bungalow colony or whatever it is would like, to have some interesting historical lecture during that week. It's around the 3 weeks, 9 days. It's a time of year when people are actually interested in these stuff. I will be having a public cemetery tour of the Mount Judah Cemetery in Queens, where a lot of great tzaddikim and loads of Jewish history is. It's a very historic place. I'm not sure yet. I'm going to publicize that exactly when I figured out the day. It's probably going to be either Friday, July 29th, or Sunday afternoon, later afternoon on July 31st. Maybe both, or perhaps another day as well. I might have two, because a lot of listeners expressed interest in participating in that. So I'm still finalizing that and will publicize the details as soon as I have them. I'm also launching a new series on the podcast next week. So stay tuned for that. This is going to be about Jews saving Jews during the Holocaust. On one hand, saving during the Holocaust is not really the major story, unfortunately, because very few were saved. The major story is what happened to the overwhelming majority in the process of what took place in the ghettos and the death camps and gas chambers and killing sites, and how that story was. But as human beings, we have this need to try to seek out the brighter stories amidst tragedy. So we tend to focus on the few stories where attempts were made to save them. So when we talk about Hatzalah, about saving Jews during the Holocaust, primarily most narratives focus on either non-Jews saving Jews at risk to their own life, Chasidei Umot Olam, right, righteous among the nations, or which are great stories, or Jewish communities on the outside of Nazi-occupied Europe, saving Jews on the inside, stories about the joint, or in different diplomats, or in Switzerland, or in Turkey, or Rachel Sternbuch and Renee Reichman, the Hatzalah in New York, and the American Jewish Committee, and Yaakov Griffel in Turkey, and the Yishuv in Palestine. Those are all the stories we're used to. This series that I'm going to be talking about will focus on another story entirely: Jews saving other Jews under Nazi occupation. In other words, both parties, the ones who are saving and the ones who they are saving, are both under Nazi occupation. In other words, they're both victims. They're both being chased. They're both are part of, ostensibly, from the Nazis' point of view, part of the final solution. That's a very compelling narrative. A very, very interesting story, and has gone under the radar for way too long. It's a very important story also. Some of the ones are more famous, the Bielski brothers and the Partisans, or the working group in Slovakia, Gisi Fleischman, Michael Weissmandel, and Oscar Newman, those people, those are somewhat famous. But other stories that I'm going to discuss, both of those I will have episodes on in this series, but lesser known ones as well, such as the very unique story of Oswald Rufeisen, or Brother Daniel, in Mir, how he saved Jews in Mir, Dr. Gisela Perl in Auschwitz. Ironically, her story involves abortion, which is in the news lately. The escape from Sobibor's story, different activities in France and Belgium. We have really, really incredible stories that are not as famous, but just as heroic, and of course very, very fascinating and interesting. And I think everyone's going to enjoy it. So in order to get this series off the ground, we're going to need some sponsorships. So please be in touch with me about sponsoring any one of these episodes or any stories of Jews, saving Jews during the Holocaust that I mentioned. They are available. Be in touch with me at yehuda@yehudagebrer.com. I mentioned that abortion's in the news, a very historic day on the U.S. Supreme Court. That's, of course, related more to U.S. history and the process of government intervention into private lives. And we all know how well government intervention into private lives boded well for Jews throughout history. But speaking of which, we probably should do an episode on the Tzitz Eliezer of Eliezer Waldenberg, a great Paisik of the 20th century, a fascinating personality with many historic and pioneering psukim in halacha on many medical halachic issues, including on abortion. So that would be another great story to explore as well at some point. In other news, there was just posted yesterday on the Svarim Chatter podcast, an interview with Dr. Ben-Sion Klabansky in his book, The Golden Age of Lithuanian Yeshivas. It was translated into English. I read, of course, the Hebrew one, and I use it all the time. It's one of my go-to books. It's like my Bible for everything about the Lithuanian Torah world in the interwar period and even a little bit before. It's basically everything I know. In other words, I was very happy that it was in Hebrew, that no one else can read it. And this way I feel special and knowledgeable. And now all you guys can read it. You should all read it. It's a great book, The Golden Age of Lithuanian Yeshivas by Dr. Ben-Sion Klabansky. And if you all read it, then we're all going to be equal in knowledge. There's going to be nothing separating me from any of the listeners because everything I know comes from that book. So it's a great interview. You should also listen to the podcast. A great interviewer, as usual. He's an excellent interviewer. And I know Dr. Klabansky personally. I've emailed him. I've met him personally. He's a very special man and has done a great job with that book, The Golden Age of the Lithuanian Yeshiva World in the Interwar Period. So, just came back from a trip with a family. Family trips are very in vogue now. Do family trips, explore family histories and roots. And we're in Prague and Hungary, Slovakia, a couple other countries. And while in Prague, the conversation, as it has in the last several trips to Prague, it turns to Shir. Shlomo Yehuda Rapoport, the Rabbi of Prague, the Rabbi Maskil of Prague. So I always think whenever I bring a group to Prague that the conversation is going to revolve around the Maharal of Prague. It's going to revolve around the Noda B'Yehuda of Yecheskel Landau, two very, very important historical figures who dominated Prague life in their eras. And yet, all the recent groups I have are all in whatever they're all interested is in Shir, Shlomo Yehuda Rapoport, and his unique story, and of course the Goyim of Prague. So that becomes something to talk about. So I decided that this episode will talk about Shir and his story and his place in Jewish history. And of course, it's a wider narrative as well. It's not specifically about him. We encounter Shir in the Spanish synagogue or the Spanish temple, which is the Reform temple in Prague. Very gorgeous, magnificent building. And it's a little bit of a museum in the back, and they have this big prominent painting, the famous painting of Shir with his strimal and beard and payas and talus, and yet he's Shir. He's also a maskil. And then also we bump into his grave in the new cemetery. We're of course going to Rav Yecheskel Landau, the night of Yehuda, but on the way, you pass by Shir. And everyone asks, so what's this all about? So maybe one day, if we're already going in that direction, maybe one day the groups will be excited to learn about Franz Kafka too, because he's also a story in Prague, especially since we recently, during the pandemic lockdown, we experienced a Kafka-esque situation, at least in Israel we did, and all the wonderful regulations the government and the health department and the police had us all under over here. By the way, Kafka is also buried in the new Jewish cemetery in Prague, where the Noda B'Yehuda and Shir are, which, if you think about it, there's this interesting development tracing Prague through the centuries, just looking at those four personalities that I mentioned. Maharal is this medieval Jewish sage, medieval Jewish Prague and its golden age. Then we jump a couple of centuries to the Noda B'Yehuda B'Cheskel Landau, the rabbinic Prague at the beginning of the modern era, a great Paisik. And then we go to Shir, Prague as the center of change, the center of modernity, Haskalah, all that. And then Kafka in the generation before the war, he passes away from tuberculosis at the age of 40, 1924. He's the generation of assimilation and search for Jewish identity in the 20th century. So that's already a whole new level. So it's interesting. Either way, if we finally get to Shir, Shlomo Yehuda Rapoport, born in 1790 and passes away in 1867, a very confusing character of Jewish history. In a certain way, he defines the journey of Jewish identity in the 19th centuries. From Eastern Europe, travels to Western Europe, comes from the rabbinic world and joins the Haskalah, but doesn't leave Jewish tradition. He's still an observant Jew. In fact, he's still the rabbi. So it's like really confusing. Is he a maskil? Is he a rabbi? Is he observant? Is he secular? Is he Eastern European? Is he Western European? What is this guy? It's very and really the painting of him, the famous painting of him, he's got this strimal type of fur hat. He's got this talus. He's got payas in a beard. I remember when Professor Marcin Wojcinski delivered a lecture on the development of Hasidic dress. So the first slide in his PowerPoint was the picture of the Netziv of Volozhin, who's very, very far from the world of Hasidim. He's a big Litvak, Rashiva Volozhin, and he's wearing this strimal type of hat and has payas and a beard. And juxtaposed next to him is this picture of Shir, who also has this strimal type of hat with payas and a beard. And he says here, neither of these people are Hasidim. One of them is a Rosh Yeshiva, a Litvak, and one of them is a maskil. And yet both of them are wearing what we refer to as the levush, the Hasidic dress. So obviously that's I think I did an episode on Jewish dress, and I discussed this there. So you may want to check out that episode, but obviously we have to understand Hasidic dress in context as well. But you see that painting, and you're like, whoa, so this looks like some sort of rabbinic figure. But we know he's also a maskil. He's part of the Jewish Enlightenment and all that, all those connotations of the 19th century in Galicia and then later in Prague. So the story of Shir is more reflective of a wider narrative of what is Haskalah and what is a maskil. Is it the black and white version that many of us grew up with? That there's, Haskalah is just another way of saying secularization, or is there a lot of gray area? There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of complexities, and it's really understanding the 19th century, and we don't want to, have this anachronistic view that anything we assume in the 21st century or the 20th century, we throw back to the 19th, because the 19th was a very different and very dynamic Jewish situation in the Jewish community at that time, because the Haskalah is a process, and the early Haskalah, the early maskilim, were observant Jews, followed halacha, came from the rabbinic world, did not change their dress initially, at least many of them didn't, most of them didn't, and they had these views of incorporating certain elements from the surrounding society to improve the Jewish people, languages, literature, values, and so on, education, different things like that, which is worth discussing, and perhaps we will in future episodes. But right now we're going to do it through the prism of Shir's life. And it's different in each locality, meaning Shir grows up in Galicia, in Lvov. That's his world, and later on he moves to Prague. And Prague is already much more Central Europe. It's much more secular by the time he arrives. He's considered a radical maskil, and not radical. He's never considered radical. He's considered a maskil in Galicia. In Prague, he's considered pretty conservative. He's looked at as somewhat of a more traditionalist in Prague, because Prague by the mid-19th century had already been very secularized. There's a recent book about him, just published last year. I didn't get a chance to read it yet, so I have not yet read it. It's in Hebrew by Natan Shifris. It's called Shir Chadash, Shlomo Yehuda Rapoport, Rabbanut, Haskalah, and Leumiyut, nationalism. But so how do I have a right to say an episode about him if I haven't even read the book? But since not reading a book has not stopped many a tour guide from relating the narrative on tour, so it won't stop me either on my podcast. So hopefully what I'll say is not made up. He's born into a rabbinic family, very prominent rabbinic family, the Rapoports, the Kayanim, the famous Meyuchas with their prestigious lineage. He's born in Lvov in the new Austrian Galicia. This is following the partitions of Poland at around the time of his birth. It's now Austrian Galicia. That's what he grows up in. And Lvov is a major center of Eastern Galicia. He's a young budding Torah scholar, initially mainstream. He marries the daughter of Rav Aryeh Leib Heller, the Ketzos Hachoshen. So this later maskil rabbi is the son-in-law of the Ketzos Hachoshen. Later on, he'd edit, comment, and publish the Avnei Miluim of his father-in-law, and with his own comments, his hagois, his comments, and his addition with his commentary. Not commentary, he has some comments here and there, and his edits are featured in every Avnei Miluim used today and studied intensely in today's yeshivas all around the world. And I'm assuming that most yeshiva students are unaware when they study these Avnei Miluims that they're using this maskil son-in-law's edition of his publishing. Either way, in his 20s, he begins exploring his intellectual world, and to help things along, this is following the passing of his father-in-law, the Ketzos Hachoshen. So God forbid that he should be a maskil in his father-in-law's lifetime. And he starts, so he explores his intellectual world, and he exhibits what were then considered maskilic tendencies in the milieu of Galicia emerging at that time. Primarily, there were three habits that were associated with the early Galician Haskalah, and Shir engaged in all three. Number one, medieval Jewish philosophy, such as Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam, but many other works as well. Two is languages, German, French, others. If we would move further north and further east to the Russian Jewish Haskalah, then it would naturally include Russian or Polish. Polish would also be in Austrian Galicia, by the way. Different languages, European languages, sometimes even the ancient classical languages of Greek or Latin. And number three, reading books, being exposed to literature, history, science, general literature. And those are three intellectual engagements that they would incorporate. But more importantly, from a social perspective, he began doing two other things that was part of a social framework that was associated with the early Galicia Haskalah. It was to associate with other maskilim, the early Galician maskilim such as Nachman Krochmal, Yehuda Leib Mizes, Yitzchak Orter, Shimshon Bloch, and most importantly, Yosef Perl, probably the most famous and influential of all the Galician maskilim of his generation, and he and Shir were very close, especially when Shir arranged for him to, attain the rabbinate in Tarnopol, where Shir's base was, where his school was. And along with these intellectual tendencies and social interactions came another component of Galician Haskalah of his day, which Shir engaged in, which was criticism of Hasidim and the Hasidic movement, which came along. It was like, A plus B equals C. If you're a maskil in Galicia during the early 1800s, then critique of Hasidism was like, that was basically part and part from Gottlob, everyone from that generation in that area. He was more in Russia, but engaged in that activity. Even criticism of certain elements of the non-Hasidic community as well, including writing and publishing pamphlets in this regard. if we think about it, it's interesting because his father-in-law, the Ketzos Hachoshen, and many other prominent Galician rabbis of the previous generation counted themselves among the Misnagdim. So opposition to Hasidism per se in rabbinic circles was not unique. In the earlier generation, the Misnagdim were primarily from the rabbinic establishment. Brod, or Brody, and other places in Galicia were centers of opposition to the Hasidic movement in the early stages. So the next generation, simply that baton is passed to the maskilim as the opponents of the Hasidic movement. That's a certain irony that I think is sometimes overlooked. In fact, the irony with Shir is that he wrote specifically against something of the Chayz of Lublin, of his generation, and the danger inherent in one of the teachings of the Chayz of Lublin regarding the power of the tzaddik in regards to halachic tradition and adherence. In other words, Shir wrote in opposite. The Chayz was writing about the power of the tzaddik and his influence on halacha. And Shir was writing in opposition to that. In other words, that one must adhere to the text of the halacha, and the tzaddik of the generation has no right to change the halacha. So you have this incredible situation, and this might be the only instance that I know of where a maskil is sticking up for strict adherence to traditional halacha in opposition to a Hasidic tzaddik who, in his opinion, he felt was not. Because he was coming up with these ways of halacha is flexible and it's able to be changed because of the power of the tzaddik. So it's an incredible situation. That's unique to the early generations of Haskalah that you would not have later on when it's not Haskalah, when it's secularization or even assimilation. Obviously, they wouldn't be concerned too much about halacha. But here in the Haskalah generations, when these people are ostensibly still observant Jews, but still just to have these modernist tendencies and exposures and intellectual pursuits, so they can have that wild situation where the maskil is opposing the tzaddik about halacha. In any event, in 1816, it seems that he was, because of his views and because of his activities, he was placed in some sort of cherem by the Rabbi of Lvov, by the local Rabbi Rabbi Yankiv Orenstein, the Yeshivas Yaakov, for the Shir's Haskalah activities. And he was married, he had a family, so he struggled to support himself for many years, in all kinds of different business pursuits. He wrote in his spare time. His writings was vast, an enormous amount of writing. He wrote biographies. He engaged in all kinds of research. He wrote books and pamphlets, and he took his research methodology seriously. In other words, he's one of the early of Jewish studies, Chochmat Israel. And there's some sort of fancy German name that people like to throw around, but I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to bother. But Jewish studies, or Chochmat Israel, I do know how to pronounce, and that is to take the study of Judaism and its history and everything involved with it seriously and scientifically. And he's one of the early contributors to that in history and poetry. He writes an encyclopedia, all kinds of Jewish studies. He writes the history of the Jews of Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia, some like unique, quirky kind of things. He lays the first research foundations to biographies of Reb Sadia Gaon, the Aruch, Reb Nassim of Rome, Reb Hai Gaon, Reb Nissim Gaon, Reb Elazar HaKali, Reb Benu Hananel. He pioneered research on the 10 lost tribes, on Karaites, on the Khazars, in Hebrew grammar. He laid down much of the foundation of Jewish studies and their research methodology, Jewish history, medieval figures, and so much more. Really a prodigious literary output. And he has friendships with maskilim all over Galicia and beyond, in Germany, in Austria, and even in Italy. One of his close friends becomes Shmuel David Luzzatto from the famous Luzzatto family, who was one of the most well-known Italian Jewish intellectuals, maskilim rabbis of that generation in Padua as well. Yosef Perl, his close friend, the most famous maskil that I mentioned, he arranges for him to get the rabbinate in Tarnopol, which is a prominent city in Austrian Galicia. and for a twofold purpose, for both to get, because he was struggling financially for so long. Shir was struggling financially for so long, and the rabbinate would give him a more stable way to support his family, and also to bring in a maskil rabbi into the Tarnopol rabbinate. There was great opposition from traditionalist elements. They went to war, basically. This is in conservative Hasidic Galicia. There were fights, there were governments, there got involved protests. Even the maskil Nachman Krochmal did not support Shir's rabbinical position there because he felt it was too early. Too soon, too early. This time is not yet ripe for a maskil rabbi of a major Galician town. It's a mistake. It's just going to cause fighting and in the Jewish community, and it's not healthy. No one's going to gain from it, and it didn't. The rabbinate was unsustainable. And Yosef Perl, who was his biggest supporter, who brought him in there, he dies 2 years later in 1839. So Shir saw that it was not working, so he left a year later after a stormy 3 years in the Tarnopol rabbinate. In 1840, he moves to Prague. The rabbinate in Prague at that time almost went to another rabbi maskil, the Maritz Chias, or Tzir Chias, who's another story. But in the end, Shir got it. So Prague was definitely looking for a more progressive rabbi. Now, Prague during the time of Shir had as far as traditional Jewish observance, had deteriorated significantly from the previous century when the Rabbi Yehuda was there, and now there are a lot of there's a lot of secularization, there's a lot of integration, acculturation, and someone like Shir, who in Galicia was the traditionalist elements were so opposed to him in the rabbinate in Galicia, in Tarnopol, excuse me. And here in Prague, he's considered too traditional. He's too frum. And he starts to engage in polemics and fights with many of the other maskilim and progressives of his day that they're going too far. With Abraham Geiger, even with Zachariah Frankel, he backs up Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch at some point against Zachariah Frankel's Darchei HaMishnah when Frankel refuses to back down refuses to give a clear position of his belief in Torah Misinai. So it's very interesting how in the next 27 years he's the rabbi till his passing is the rabbi in Prague. He's engaged in polemics. He's fighting all the time with everyone on the right and on the left. He's in the middle of the road. The traditionalists consider him too progressive. The progressives consider him too traditionalist. He's in the middle. He's this Galician maskil of the mid-1800s, and he's a frum maskil. And he looked like he did, like that painting said. He serves as an Orthodox, observant rabbi and Jew for the rest of his life, and yet he's a maskil. So what's that legacy? What's that, the question is, what do we do with that as far as Jewish history is concerned? Lately, there's been this trend to retroactively convert maskilim from those early generations. It's been done to quite a few of them. It's been done to Shlomo Dubna and Mendel Laffin and Menashe Me'ilya and I'm forgetting the names, and a few others. I think there's even a more daring attempt to do it with Naftali Hertz Weisel, which is pretty gutsy. But do we need to convert them to make them frum in order to be able to live with them? Because we can't live with this middle ground. It's an anomaly in Jewish history, or we can just leave them be for what they were in the 19th century or 18th century. That's a big question. That's a topic for another time. We can examine some of these other early maskilim. The question is if it's even possible to retroactively convert a Shir to make him frummer, because he was so prominent in Haskalah circles that it would be really difficult to negate all that. So we might have to live with this conundrum that Shir is, and live with the fact that Jewish identity in the 19th century was quite dynamic, and the confrontation of the Jewish community with the modern era is a fascinating process, and how they grapple with it. So this is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.